The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I watched my former best friend, Catherine, adjust her veil one final time before walking down the aisle to marry my ex-husband. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in the third row of Sacred Heart Chapel, invited as a dear family friend to witness the union of two people who had systematically destroyed my life while pretending to care about my well-being. What they didn't know was that tucked inside my purse was a manila envelope containing 3 years' worth of evidence that would shatter their fairy tale wedding in ways they never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, I had been blissfully unaware that my marriage to Marcus was crumbling from the inside. We lived in a sprawling colonial house in Millbrook Heights, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business but pretended they didn't. Marcus worked as a financial advisor at Preston Associates, while I managed the local animal shelter that I'd built from nothing into the county's most successful rescue organization. After 12 years of marriage, I thought we had found our rhythm. He handled our investments and retirement planning, while I poured my heart into saving abandoned animals and organizing fundraising galas that brought the community together every spring and fall. Catherine had been my closest friend since college. We'd been roommates at Northwestern, maid of honor at each other's weddings, and godmothers to each other's children. She was divorced with twin boys, working as a real estate agent specializing in luxury properties. Every Thursday, we met for lunch at Rosemary's Bistro downtown, sharing everything from work frustrations to marriage advice. She was the one who listened when I complained that Marcus seemed distant lately, working longer hours and taking mysterious phone calls that he'd step outside to answer. She was also the one who suggested I surprise him with a romantic weekend getaway to rekindle our spark. The first sign something was wrong came on a rainy Tuesday in March. I'd arrived home early from a veterinary conference to find Marcus's car in the driveway alongside Catherine's silver BMW. Nothing unusual there. She often stopped by to chat or borrow something. But when I walked through the front door, the house felt different. Too quiet. Too still. Like the air itself was holding secrets. I called out hello, but got no response. Their voices drifted down from upstairs, low and intense, coming from our bedroom. My first thought was that something terrible had happened, maybe an emergency with one of her boys. I climbed the stairs quietly, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like an important conversation. But as I got closer, the words became clearer and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Catherine's voice, breathless and urgent, saying she couldn't keep pretending everything was normal when she spent every day thinking about him. Marcus responding that they had to be patient, that the timing had to be perfect because there was too much money at stake to rush things. Then Catherine laughing, that familiar throaty laugh I'd heard 1,000 times, saying she'd never imagined she could feel this way about her best friend's husband. I stood frozen in the hallway outside my own bedroom door, listening to my husband and my best friend plan my betrayal with the casual efficiency of people organizing a dinner party. They talked about how to handle the divorce, how to minimize Marcus's financial exposure, how to present their relationship to our social circle in a way that wouldn't make them look like the villains. Catherine had already been subtly laying groundwork, telling mutual friends that she was worried about me, that I'd been acting erratic and obsessive about the animal shelter, that maybe the stress was affecting my mental health. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of their deception. They'd been involved for over 8 months, meeting at hotels during my business trips and at Catherine's house when her boys were with their father. Marcus had been systematically moving assets around, transferring money to accounts I didn't know existed, preparing for a divorce that would leave me with as little as possible. Catherine had been using her real estate connections to get valuations on our property and identify potential buyers, already planning to help Marcus sell our home once I was out of the picture. What devastated me most wasn't just the affair, but the calculated cruelty of it all. Catherine had sat across from me dozens of times over the past months, listening to me worry about my marriage, offering comfort and advice, all while sleeping with my husband and plotting to take everything I'd worked for. She had even suggested the marriage counselor we'd started seeing, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, claiming she'd heard wonderful things about her approach to couples therapy. Now I realize she probably recommended Dr. Walsh because she knew exactly how to manipulate the sessions to make me look like the problem. I backed away from the bedroom door and slipped out of the house before they realized I'd been there. For the next 3 hours, I sat in my car in the animal shelter parking lot, staring at the building I'd poured my heart into for the past decade. The place where I'd saved thousands of animals, where I'd built a team of dedicated volunteers, where I'd created something meaningful and lasting. Everything I thought I knew about my life had been revealed as an elaborate lie. But this place, these animals who depended on me, this was real. When I finally went home that evening, Marcus was in his study working on his laptop, acting completely normal. He asked about my conference, kissed my cheek, and suggested we order Thai food for dinner. I played along, matching his casual tone, pretending I hadn't heard him planning my destruction just hours earlier. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The naive, trusting woman who'd left for that veterinary conference no longer existed. Over the next several weeks, I became a detective in my own life. I started paying attention to patterns I'd previously ignored. Marcus's late nights at the office that coincided perfectly with Catherine's mysterious cancellations of our lunch dates. The way he'd suddenly become interested in our financial statements, asking me to sign papers he claimed were routine updates to our investment accounts. The subtle changes in how our mutual friends interacted with me, the slightly pitying looks and carefully worded questions about how I was handling stress. Catherine continued our Thursday lunches as if nothing had changed, but now I noticed things I'd been blind to before. How she steered conversations toward my supposed emotional instability. How she'd casually mention that Marcus seemed overwhelmed by my demands lately. How she'd suggest that maybe I was too invested in the animal shelter, that perhaps I should consider stepping back for my own mental health. Each lunch became a masterclass in manipulation, watching my best friend systematically undermine my confidence while pretending to care about my well-being. The breakthrough came when I decided to install a security system in our house. I told Marcus it was because of a recent break-in in our neighborhood, which was true enough. What I didn't mention was that the system included hidden cameras in several rooms, including his study, where he conducted most of his private business. Modern technology made it remarkably easy to monitor my own home remotely, watching the recordings on my phone during quiet moments at the shelter. Within 2 weeks, I had documented evidence of their affair, including intimate conversations where they discussed their future plans and mocked my obliviousness to their deception. More importantly, I captured Marcus on video, moving documents and making phone calls related to our financial accounts. I heard him discussing with his lawyer how to structure the divorce to protect his assets, how to use my dedication to the animal shelter against me by claiming I'd been neglecting our marriage and our financial responsibilities. The most damning evidence came from a conversation between Marcus and Catherine where they discussed their timeline. Catherine wanted him to file for divorce immediately, but Marcus insisted they needed to wait until after he'd completed some complex financial maneuvers that would take several more months. He'd been systematically devaluing our joint assets while moving money into investment vehicles that would be harder for me to claim in a divorce settlement. Catherine laughed and called him brilliant, saying she'd never been attracted to someone so strategically minded. Armed with this information, I began building my own strategy. I consulted with Patricia Hendricks, the best divorce attorney in the state, explaining the situation and providing her with copies of all my evidence. Patricia was a fierce advocate, known for taking on complex cases involving hidden assets and financial manipulation. She listened to my story with the focused attention of a surgeon planning a delicate operation, taking notes and asking probing questions about Marcus's business relationships and investment strategies. Patricia's investigation revealed the full scope of Marcus's deception. He'd been working with a network of associates to hide marital assets, creating shell companies and offshore accounts that existed solely to deprive me of my fair share of our wealth.
The man I'd trusted with our financial future had been systematically stealing from our marriage for months, all while making me feel guilty for not being more involved in our money management. Meanwhile, I maintained the performance of my life, acting like the clueless wife who suspected nothing. At our counseling sessions with Dr. Walsh, I played the role Marcus and Catherine had written for me, appearing anxious and overwhelmed, while Marcus presented himself as the patient, supportive husband dealing with his wife's increasing instability. Catherine would check in with me regularly, expressing concern about my mental state and offering to help me find additional professional support.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The hardest part wasn't the deception itself, but watching people I'd considered friends gradually distance themselves from me as Catherine and Marcus's whisper campaign took effect. Couples we'd socialized with for years began excluding me from gatherings, claiming they didn't want to put me in uncomfortable situations while I was going through such a difficult time. The isolation was deliberate and effective, designed to leave me without a support network when Marcus finally pulled the trigger on our divorce. 3 months into my secret investigation, Marcus announced that he thought we should take a break from each other to evaluate our relationship. He'd found me a lovely apartment closer to the animal shelter, he said, somewhere I could focus on my work without the distractions of maintaining our large house. He'd continue paying all our bills, of course, including the rent on my new place, because he wanted me to have space to heal and grow. Catherine was there when he made this announcement, having stopped by for an impromptu visit that I now realized was carefully orchestrated. I moved into the apartment Marcus had selected, a sterile 2-bedroom unit in a complex that felt more like a way station than a home. But the distance gave me freedom to work with Patricia more intensively, building an airtight case against both Marcus and his network of financial conspirators. We documented every hidden asset, every fraudulent transfer, every lie he told about our joint finances. Patricia's forensic accountant traced money through multiple shell companies and discovered investments worth nearly $2 million that Marcus had concealed from me. During the separation period, Catherine became even more solicitous, stopping by my apartment regularly with takeout food and wine, positioning herself as my primary support system while my marriage crumbled. She'd update me on Marcus's emotional state, claiming he was devastated by our separation but needed time to figure out what he really wanted. She suggested that maybe this break was exactly what our marriage needed, that perhaps Marcus and I had grown apart because we'd stopped appreciating each other. The cruelest part of Catherine's performance was how she positioned herself as my advocate while simultaneously preparing to become my replacement. She'd mention casual encounters with Marcus, running into him at the grocery store or the gym, always emphasizing how lost and confused he seemed without me. She'd relay messages from him that sounded caring and hopeful, suggesting he was using this time for deep self-reflection about our relationship. What Catherine didn't know was that my security cameras were still active in the house, and I could see exactly how lost and confused Marcus was during our separation, which is to say, not at all. Within a week of my moving out, Catherine was spending nights there regularly. They'd moved her belongings into my closet and converted my home office into a playroom for her twin boys. They were living as a family in the house Marcus and I had built together, while he fed me lies about needing space for personal growth. The recordings from this period provided some of the most devastating evidence Patricia and I collected. Marcus and Catherine discussed their wedding plans in detail, including their intention to honeymoon in Italy using money from accounts he'd hidden from me. They talked about selling our house and buying a new property together, something larger that could accommodate Catherine's boys and their plans for additional children. Catherine had already started planning how to transition her real estate business to focus on luxury properties exclusively, confident that Marcus's wealth would give her access to higher-end clients. 4 months after our separation began, Marcus filed for divorce.
The papers cited irreconcilable differences and my alleged emotional instability as grounds for ending our marriage. He requested primary ownership of our house, claiming I'd abandoned the property when I moved to the apartment. He also sought to minimize spousal support, arguing that my salary from the animal shelter was sufficient to maintain my lifestyle, and that our joint assets were far less valuable than I believed due to recent market downturns. Catherine was there when Marcus served me the divorce papers, offering tissues and emotional support while internally celebrating the next step in their plan. She assured me that Marcus was being generous, considering how difficult our separation had been, and that I should consider accepting his offer rather than dragging things out through expensive litigation. She'd researched divorce attorneys, she said, and could recommend someone affordable who specialized in amicable settlements. The attorney Catherine recommended was James Morrison, a pleasant man in his 60s who seemed more interested in facilitating quick resolutions than fighting for his clients' rights. When I met with him to discuss my case, he immediately began suggesting compromises and expressing concern about the costs of challenging Marcus's financial statements. He seemed remarkably well informed about the details of my marriage and separation, almost as if someone had briefed him extensively before our meeting. I played along with Catherine's recommendation, meeting with James Morrison twice, while secretly working with Patricia to prepare our real strategy. Patricia had been building relationships with forensic accountants and private investigators, assembling a team capable of exposing the full scope of Marcus's financial deception. We had documentation of every hidden asset, every fraudulent transfer, every lie he told about our joint wealth. 6 weeks before their wedding date set, Marcus and Catherine made their relationship public. They appeared together at the annual Chamber of Commerce gala, Marcus introducing Catherine as his girlfriend to mutual friends who expressed surprise, but not shock.
The narrative they'd carefully constructed over months of preparation held up perfectly. I was the unstable wife who'd become obsessed with animal rescue work at the expense of my marriage. Marcus was the patient husband who'd tried everything to save our relationship before finally accepting that we'd grown apart. Catherine was the longtime friend who'd supported both of us through our difficulties and had naturally grown closer to Marcus during the painful process of our separation. Our social circle absorbed this story with remarkable ease, perhaps because it confirmed suspicions they'd already been encouraged to develop about my mental state. Several people who'd known me for years began treating me with the careful sympathy reserved for someone whose grip on reality had become questionable. The animal shelter became both my refuge and my prison, the place where I could still feel competent and valuable, but also the evidence of my alleged obsession that had destroyed my marriage. 2 weeks before the wedding, Catherine invited me to lunch at Rosemary's Bistro one final time. She'd been thinking about our friendship, she said, and how much it meant to her that we'd remained close despite everything that had happened with Marcus. She hoped and understood she'd never intended for their relationship to develop the way it had, that sometimes love happened in unexpected ways that couldn't be controlled or predicted. I listened to her explain how she'd fought her feelings for months, how she'd encouraged Marcus to work harder on our marriage, how she'd hoped our separation might help us find our way back to each other. But eventually, she said, she'd realized that denying their connection wasn't fair to anyone, especially not to me, because I deserved a husband who was completely committed to our relationship rather than someone whose heart belonged elsewhere. Catherine's performance was flawless, hitting every note of regret and inevitability that would make her seem like a reluctant participant in a love story rather than an active architect of my betrayal. She cried actual tears while explaining how conflicted she'd felt about accepting Marcus's proposal, knowing it would hurt me even though our marriage was already over. She'd almost said no, she claimed, but Marcus had convinced her that I would want them to be happy, that after everything we'd all been through together, surely I could find it in my heart to support their love. The wedding invitation had arrived 2 days after that lunch, delivered to my apartment by messenger rather than mail.
A beautiful, cream-colored card with gold embossing inviting me to witness the union of Marcus William Thornton and Catherine Marie Sullivan at Sacred Heart Chapel. The ceremony would be followed by a reception at the Grandview Country Club, where I'd attended dozens of social events during my marriage to Marcus. The invitation included a handwritten note from Catherine expressing how much it would mean to both of them if I could attend their special day. She understood if it would be too difficult emotionally, but she wanted me to know that they considered me family and hoped our friendship could survive this transition. She'd reserved a seat for me in the third row, close enough to feel included, but far enough from the immediate family section to avoid any awkwardness. I RSVP'd that I would attend, a decision that surprised both Catherine and Marcus based on their careful inquiries through mutual friends. They'd expected me to decline gracefully, perhaps citing the emotional difficulty of watching my ex-husband marry my former best friend. Instead, I confirmed my attendance and even offered to help with any last-minute preparations they might need. Catherine seemed genuinely touched by my generosity of spirit, telling everyone how grateful she was to have a friend mature enough to prioritize their happiness over her own pain. The week before the wedding, Patricia and I finalized our strategy. We had everything we needed to expose Marcus's financial crimes and Catherine's role in the elaborate deception they'd orchestrated. More importantly, we had chosen the perfect moment to reveal the truth, not in a lawyer's office or courtroom where it could be contained and managed, but in front of everyone who'd been manipulated into believing their carefully constructed narrative. Patricia had coordinated with the district attorney's office, which had been building its own case against Marcus's network of financial conspirators. My evidence had provided the missing pieces they needed to prove a pattern of fraudulent asset transfers designed to cheat divorced spouses out of their rightful settlements. Marcus wasn't just stealing from me. He was part of a larger scheme that had been operating for years, helping wealthy men hide assets from their wives during divorce proceedings. The morning of the wedding, I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that was elegant but not attention-seeking, professional but not severe. I wanted to look like the competent, stable woman I'd always been, not the emotionally unstable character Catherine and Marcus had created to justify their actions. I carried a small purse containing the manila envelope that would destroy their fairy tale, along with backup copies stored electronically and already shared with law enforcement. Sacred Heart Chapel was beautifully decorated with white roses and baby's breath, exactly the kind of romantic setting Catherine had always dreamed of for her second wedding. The guest list included everyone from our old social circle, Marcus's business associates, and Catherine's extended family. I recognized faces from a dozen years of dinner parties, charity events, and neighborhood gatherings. People who'd known me as Marcus's devoted wife, Catherine's loyal friend, and the passionate advocate for abandoned animals who'd built the county's most successful rescue organization. As I took my designated seat in the third row, several people nodded politely, but didn't approach for conversation. I was the gracious ex-wife who'd risen above her pain to support her former husband's happiness, a role that made everyone slightly uncomfortable, but earned their grudging respect.
Behind me, I could hear whispered conversations about how difficult this must be for me, and how admirable it was that I'd chosen to attend. The ceremony began with Catherine's twin boys walking down the aisle as ring bearers, followed by her sister as matron of honor and Marcus's brother as best man. When the wedding march began and Catherine appeared at the back of the chapel, a collective intake of breath acknowledged how beautiful she looked. Her dress was stunning, a classic A-line silhouette with delicate lace details and a cathedral train. She'd chosen a style that was elegant and sophisticated, nothing like the bohemian dress I'd worn at my own wedding to Marcus 12 years earlier. Marcus stood at the altar looking genuinely emotional as Catherine walked toward him. Whatever else could be said about their relationship, the love between them appeared real and deep. They'd destroyed my life to be together, but they hadn't been faking their feelings for each other. In some ways, that made their betrayal even more painful, knowing that their happiness was built on the deliberate destruction of everything I'd thought was permanent and secure. Father Mackenzie began the ceremony with traditional words about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of honesty and commitment in building a life together. The irony was so thick I almost laughed out loud, listening to a priest extol virtues that the bride and groom had systematically violated for the past year. They repeated their vows with apparent sincerity, promising to love and honor each other through all of life's challenges, while I sat 3 rows back holding evidence of their elaborate deception. When Father Mackenzie asked if anyone present had reasons why Marcus and Catherine should not be joined in marriage, the chapel fell completely silent. This was the moment traditional wedding ceremonies included, but no one ever expected to be interrupted. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, waiting for the brief pause to end so the ceremony could continue toward its inevitable conclusion. I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than I'd expected them to be. "I do," I said clearly, my voice carrying easily through the hushed chapel. The reaction was immediate and electric. Heads turned toward me in shock, gasps echoed off the vaulted ceiling, and Catherine went completely pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Marcus looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, recognition, and dawning horror as he realized that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "Father Mackenzie," I continued, my voice calm and professional, "I have evidence that this marriage is being entered into fraudulently as part of a conspiracy to hide assets and defraud me of my rightful share of marital property." I opened my purse and withdrew the manila envelope, holding it high enough for everyone to see. This envelope contains 3 years of documentation proving that Marcus Thornton and Catherine Sullivan have been conducting an affair while systematically stealing from my marriage, hiding assets and fraudulent accounts, and manipulating legal proceedings to deprive me of property that is rightfully mine under state law. The chapel erupted in shocked murmurs and exclamations. Catherine gripped Marcus's arm like she was drowning, her carefully planned perfect day disintegrating in real time. Marcus stared at me with something approaching respect, finally understanding that the woman he'd dismissed as an emotionally unstable obstacle had been several steps ahead of him for months. Furthermore, I continued, raising my voice slightly to be heard over the growing commotion, the district attorney's office has been investigating Marcus's involvement in a network of financial conspirators who specialize in helping divorced men hide assets from their wives. This wedding was intended to be the culmination of an 18-month plan to steal approximately $2 million from our joint marital estate. Father Mackenzie looked completely bewildered, clearly having never encountered a situation like this in decades of performing wedding ceremonies. Several guests had pulled out their phones and were either taking pictures or making calls, probably to lawyers or journalists who would be very interested in this story. Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a desperate whisper that somehow carried through the chapel's acoustics. "This is insane," she said, looking around the room for support. "She's having some kind of breakdown. We knew she might do something like this. She's been obsessed with trying to destroy our happiness ever since Marcus left her." But I was prepared for this response, had anticipated exactly how they would try to dismiss my accusations. "I have video recordings," I said simply. "Hours of footage from security cameras in the house Marcus and I shared, showing both of you planning this conspiracy in detail. I have recordings of conversations where you discuss hiding assets, manipulating legal proceedings, and mocking my supposed ignorance of your plans." I reached into my purse again and pulled out a small tablet, holding it up for the congregation to see.
This tablet contains copies of financial documents showing the shell companies Marcus created to hide our joint assets, bank records proving fraudulent transfers of money that legally belongs to both of us, and correspondence between Marcus and his associates discussing strategies for minimizing his financial exposure in our divorce.
The silence in the chapel was now complete, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. Catherine looked like she might faint, swaying slightly in her wedding dress, while Marcus stared at me with the dawning realization that his carefully orchestrated plan had been exposed in the most public way possible. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit will be here shortly," I added, glancing at my watch. "I believe they're particularly interested in speaking with Marcus about his business relationships and investment strategies. Catherine, they'll probably want to discuss your role in helping to hide assets and manipulate legal proceedings, which I believe constitutes conspiracy to commit fraud." As if summoned by my words, the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the chapel parking lot. Through the stained glass windows, we could see the unmistakable silhouettes of law enforcement officers approaching the building. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. "You can't do this here," he said. "Not at our wedding. Not in front of everyone." I looked at him with the same calm professionalism I'd maintained throughout this entire ordeal. "You made the choice to build your happiness on lies and theft," I replied. "You chose to steal from me while pretending to care about my well-being. You chose to manipulate our friends into believing I was mentally unstable to cover your crimes. This is simply the natural consequence of those choices." Catherine was crying now, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "We never meant for it to happen this way," she sobbed. "We fell in love. We couldn't help it." "You could help stealing $2 million from me," I said. "You could help lying to investigators about our joint assets. You could help manipulating legal proceedings to commit fraud. Love might excuse the affair, Catherine, but it doesn't excuse the crimes you committed to profit from it." The chapel doors opened and FBI agents entered, followed by local police officers and what appeared to be federal prosecutors. The guests sat frozen in their pews, witnessing something that would become the most talked about event in our social circle's history. Agent Sarah Collins, whom I'd been working with for the past month, approached the altar with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. "Marcus Thornton, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal racketeering statutes," she announced, producing handcuffs. "Catherine Sullivan, you're also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice." As the agents read them their rights, I looked around the chapel at the faces of people who'd known me for years. Some appeared shocked by the dramatic turn of events. Others seemed to be reassessing everything they believed about my supposed emotional instability and obsession with animal rescue work. Patricia Hendricks appeared at my elbow, having coordinated with law enforcement to be present for the arrests. The judge signed the emergency order freezing all of Marcus's assets pending the criminal investigation. The house, the hidden accounts, the shell companies, everything. It's all locked down until we can sort out what belongs to whom. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of anticlimax after months of planning for this moment. Marcus and Catherine were being led away in handcuffs, their fairy tale wedding transformed into a public humiliation that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The guests were filing out of the chapel in stunned silence, already composing the phone calls and text messages that would spread this story throughout our community within hours. But more importantly, I had reclaimed my voice and my power. For months, I'd been cast as the villain in their love story, the unstable ex-wife who couldn't accept her husband's happiness with someone else. Today, I'd revealed the truth about who they really were and what they'd really done. The animal shelter was still waiting for me, along with the hundreds of rescued animals who depended on my care and advocacy. My real estate attorney had found me a beautiful house just outside town, with acreage enough for the sanctuary I'd always dreamed of building. And Patricia was confident that once the criminal proceedings were complete, I'd recover not just my stolen assets, but significant additional damages for the fraud they'd perpetrated. As I walked out of Sacred Heart Chapel into the afternoon sunlight, I realized that Marcus and Catherine had given me an unexpected gift. In their desperation to steal my past, they'd forced me to fight for my future in ways that made me stronger and more independent than I'd ever been before. The woman who'd discovered their affair 6 months ago had been devastated by betrayal and uncertain about her ability to survive alone. The woman walking away from their ruined wedding was ready to build something entirely new, something that belonged completely to her, something that no one could ever take away again. The media circus began within hours of the arrests. By evening, news vans lined the street outside Sacred Heart Chapel, and reporters were calling everyone who'd attended the wedding, hungry for details about what they were already calling the wedding day bust. Channel 7 News led their broadcast with shaky cell phone footage of Marcus and Catherine being led away in handcuffs, their wedding attire a stark contrast to the federal agents surrounding them. I spent that first night at Patricia's house, avoiding the reporters camped outside my apartment and the endless stream of phone calls from people who suddenly wanted to hear my side of the story. Patricia's guest room was a sanctuary where I could process what had just happened, while she fielded calls from prosecutors, journalists, and curious acquaintances who'd heard about the dramatic confrontation. The initial news coverage focused on the spectacle of the arrests, the shocked wedding guests, and the fairy tale romance that had turned into a federal crime scene. But as more details emerged about Marcus's financial schemes, the story grew beyond local interest. The FBI had been investigating what they called the Millbrook Heights marriage fraud network for over 2 years, tracking a sophisticated operation that helped wealthy men hide assets during divorce proceedings. Marcus wasn't just stealing from me. He was part of a criminal enterprise that had defrauded dozens of divorced women out of millions of dollars in community property. His arrest at his own wedding provided federal investigators with the final pieces of evidence they needed to dismantle the entire network. By the end of the week, 17 people had been arrested, including 2 judges, 3 lawyers, and a collection of financial advisors and real estate agents who'd participated in the scheme. Catherine's role in the conspiracy was more complex than I'd initially realized. She hadn't just been Marcus's lover and accomplice in hiding our assets. She'd been actively recruiting other wealthy men going through divorces, using her real estate connections to identify targets and her personal relationships to gain their trust. The luxury properties she specialized in weren't just her business focus. They were her hunting ground for finding men with significant assets to hide. The FBI's investigation revealed that Catherine had been involved in at least 6 other cases where she'd helped divorcing men conceal property from their wives. She would befriend the wives, position herself as their supporter and confidant, then use the information she gathered to help their husbands hide assets more effectively. Her relationship with me had been the most elaborate deception, but it followed a pattern she'd perfected over several years of operation. Agent Sarah Collins visited me at Patricia's house 3 days after the wedding arrests to brief me on what they'd discovered during their initial searches of Marcus and Catherine's properties. The evidence they'd gathered went far beyond what I'd provided, revealing a sophisticated network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent real estate transactions that had been operating for nearly a decade. My situation had been particularly lucrative for the conspiracy because of the animal shelter's success and visibility in the community. Marcus had been planning to use my supposed mental instability and obsession with animal rescue as justification for gaining control of the shelter's assets as well as our personal property. The shelter had received several large donations and grants over the years, money that legally belonged to the organization, but that Marcus had been positioning himself to claim during our divorce proceedings. The revelation that they'd been targeting the animal shelter sent waves of outrage through the community that had supported the organization for years. Donors who'd contributed thousands of dollars to help abandon animals discovered that Marcus had been preparing to steal their generosity to fund his new life with Catherine. Volunteers who'd spent countless hours caring for rescued pets learned that their dedication was being weaponized against me in a fraudulent legal strategy.
Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the marriage counselor Catherine had recommended, was arrested on the fourth day after the wedding arrests. The FBI's investigation revealed that she'd been providing fabricated psychological evaluations designed to support claims of mental instability in divorce cases. Her professional license had been suspended pending investigation, and her patient records were being reviewed to identify other women who'd been targeted by the conspiracy. The sessions Marcus and I had attended with Dr. Walsh took on a sinister new meaning, as I realized every conversation had been choreographed to create a paper trail supporting claims that I was emotionally unstable and unfit to manage financial affairs. Her questions about my dedication to animal rescue work, my emotional responses to stress, and my relationship with Marcus had all been designed to elicit responses that could be used against me in court. James Morrison, the divorce attorney Catherine had recommended, was arrested the following week. His law practice had been serving as a pipeline for the conspiracy, steering vulnerable women toward attorneys who would encourage quick settlements rather than fighting for their rights.
He'd been receiving payments from Marcus's network for each case, where he successfully convinced a wife to accept less than her fair share of marital assets. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving corrupt professionals across multiple industries who'd been systematically defrauding divorced women for years. Marcus and Catherine's wedding had inadvertently become the final act in a long-running criminal enterprise that had stolen millions of dollars from vulnerable women during some of the most difficult periods of their lives. As the investigation expanded, I found myself at the center of a media storm that I never could have anticipated. Reporters wanted to interview the woman who'd brought down a multi-million-dollar fraud network by standing up at a wedding. Victim advocacy groups invited me to speak about recognizing manipulation and fighting back against systematic deception. Legal experts asked for my perspective on how to protect vulnerable people from similar schemes. The attention was overwhelming and exhausting, but it also provided an opportunity to reclaim the narrative that Marcus and Catherine had been controlling for so long. Instead of the emotionally unstable woman obsessed with animal rescue, I could present myself as the competent professional who'd outsmarted a sophisticated criminal network through careful investigation and strategic planning. Patricia handled most of the media requests, but she encouraged me to do a few carefully selected interviews with reporters who seemed genuinely interested in the broader implications of the case rather than just the dramatic spectacle of the wedding arrests. The interview that had the most impact was with investigative journalist Maria Santos from The Washington Post, who was working on a series about financial fraud targeting divorced women. Maria spent several hours at Patricia's house listening to my story and reviewing the evidence I'd gathered over months of secret investigation. She was particularly interested in how the conspiracy had used my love for animal rescue work against me, turning my professional success and community involvement into supposed evidence of mental instability and obsessive behavior. The article Maria wrote was published 2 weeks after the wedding arrests, bringing national attention to both my case and the broader pattern of fraud that investigators were uncovering. The headline read, "She saved animals for years, then she had to save herself. How one woman exposed a multi-million-dollar divorce fraud network." The piece traced my journey from discovering the affair to confronting the conspirators at their own wedding. But it also examined the systematic way that successful women were being targeted and manipulated during vulnerable periods in their lives. The national coverage brought an unexpected consequence. Dozens of other women contacted Patricia's office, reporting similar experiences with mysterious asset disappearances, manipulative marriage counselors, and divorce attorneys who seemed more interested in quick settlements than fighting for their clients' rights. Agent Collins told me that my case had become a model for investigating similar fraud networks in other parts of the country. But the most meaningful response came from the animal rescue community, which rallied around me and the shelter with unprecedented support. Donations poured in from across the state as people learned about the attempt to steal money intended for abandoned animals. Volunteers traveled from neighboring counties to help with daily operations, while I dealt with legal proceedings and media attention. National animal welfare organizations offered grants and resources to help expand our programs. The shelter had never been stronger or more financially secure. But the emotional toll of the past months was starting to catch up with me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the investigation and confrontation was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and a deep sadness about the friendships and trust that had been destroyed by Marcus and Catherine's deception. Patricia suggested I take some time away from the media attention to focus on healing and planning for the future. The criminal cases against Marcus, Catherine, and their co-conspirators would take months to work through the legal system, and the civil recovery of my stolen assets would be a separate process that could take even longer. I needed to rebuild my personal life while the lawyers handled the legal complexities of unwinding years of fraudulent transactions. I decided to visit my sister Ellen in Colorado, where I could disappear from the media attention and spend time in the mountains that had always brought me peace. Ellen lived in a small town outside Denver with her husband and teenage daughter, far from the chaos that my life had become since the wedding confrontation. She'd been following the news coverage and offering support from a distance, but she was shocked by how thin and exhausted I looked when she picked me up at the airport. The 2 weeks I spent in Colorado were exactly what I needed to begin processing everything that had happened. Ellen's house was quiet and comfortable, surrounded by aspen trees and mountain views that reminded me of the larger world beyond my immediate problems. I slept late, took long walks, and avoided checking my phone for updates about the legal proceedings back home. During those peaceful days, I started thinking seriously about what I wanted my life to look like once the legal battles were resolved. The animal shelter would always be important to me, but I'd learned that I couldn't let any single thing, even something as meaningful as saving abandoned pets, become so central to my identity that losing it would destroy me. Marcus and Catherine had tried to use my dedication against me, and I needed to build a more balanced life that couldn't be weaponized by future adversaries. Ellen and I spent hours talking about the past year, trying to understand how I'd missed so many warning signs about Marcus's deception and Catherine's manipulation. Ellen had never completely trusted Catherine, she admitted, finding her questions about my marriage and mental health oddly intrusive for someone who was supposedly my friend. But Ellen had attributed those concerns to her own protective instincts, rather than recognizing them as evidence of Catherine's calculated strategy. The conversations with Ellen helped me realize that I'd been vulnerable to Marcus and Catherine's manipulation because I'd been too trusting, too willing to assume that people who claimed to care about me actually had my best interests at heart. I'd ignored my instincts when situations felt wrong because I wanted to believe that my husband and best friend were acting out of love rather than self-interest. The lesson wasn't to become cynical or suspicious of everyone, but to trust my own perceptions and reactions rather than letting other people define reality for me. When something felt wrong, it probably was wrong, regardless of how convincingly someone explained why I shouldn't trust my instincts. The woman who'd stood up at that wedding had learned to value her own judgment over other people's reassurances. While I was in Colorado, Patricia called with updates about the legal proceedings back home. Marcus and Catherine had both hired expensive defense attorneys who were trying to negotiate plea agreements that would minimize their sentences and financial penalties. The prosecutors were being aggressive about seeking maximum penalties because of the scope of the conspiracy and the number of victims who'd been defrauded over the years. The asset recovery process was moving more slowly, but steadily in my favor. Forensic accountants had traced most of the money Marcus had hidden, and federal seizure orders were freezing accounts and properties that had been purchased with stolen funds. Patricia was confident that I would eventually recover not just the $2 million that had been stolen from our marriage, but additional damages for the fraud and emotional distress I had suffered. More importantly, the investigation had revealed that Marcus's financial situation was far worse than I'd realized. His expensive lifestyle and high-stakes investment schemes had been funded largely by money stolen from divorce clients, not by legitimate business success. When the fraudulent income was removed from his portfolio, Marcus was actually deeply in debt, facing bankruptcy even without the criminal penalties he was now confronting. Catherine's situation was similarly precarious. Her luxury real estate business had been a front for recruiting wealthy divorce targets, not a genuinely successful enterprise. The expensive BMW, designer clothes, and upscale lifestyle she'd maintained were all funded by proceeds from the fraud network. When those assets were seized by federal authorities, Catherine was left with virtually nothing except mounting legal bills and the prospect of significant prison time. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus and Catherine had destroyed my life to build what turned out to be an elaborate illusion of wealth and success. They'd stolen my money to fund a lifestyle that was ultimately unsustainable, risking everything for the appearance of prosperity rather than building anything genuine or lasting. Their fairy tale romance had been financed by crime. Their dream wedding had ended in handcuffs, and their future together would be spent in federal prison. When I returned from Colorado, I found that public opinion had shifted dramatically in my favor. The initial sympathy for Marcus and Catherine as star-crossed lovers had evaporated as more details emerged about their systematic fraud and manipulation. Community leaders who'd been influenced by Catherine's whisper campaign about my mental stability were now praising my courage and intelligence in exposing the conspiracy. The mayor presented me with a commendation for public service, citing my role in bringing down a criminal network that had been operating in our community for years. The Chamber of Commerce, where Marcus and Catherine had made their relationship public just weeks earlier, issued a statement condemning financial fraud and expressing support for the victims who'd been targeted by the conspiracy. But the most meaningful recognition came from other women who'd been victimized by similar schemes in divorce proceedings. They contacted me through Patricia's office, sharing stories about mysterious asset disappearances, manipulative counselors, and attorneys who'd seemed more interested in quick settlements than fighting for their rights. Many of them had been made to feel crazy or paranoid when they questioned what was happening to their financial security during divorce proceedings. These women formed an informal support network, sharing resources and strategies for protecting themselves during vulnerable life transitions. Patricia started hosting monthly meetings at her office where divorced women could learn about recognizing financial manipulation and finding trustworthy legal representation. The group grew rapidly as word spread about a safe space where women could discuss their experiences without being dismissed or patronized. The animal shelter also became a gathering place for women who were rebuilding their lives after divorce or other major upheavals. Working with abandoned animals provided a sense of purpose and accomplishment that many of them needed while dealing with legal battles and emotional recovery. The volunteers who joined during this period brought diverse professional skills that strengthened the organization in unexpected ways. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a licensed psychologist who'd heard about our case through media coverage, offered to provide free counseling services to women who'd been victimized by divorce fraud schemes. Unlike Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the corrupt counselor who'd been part of the conspiracy, Dr. Jennifer Walsh specialized in helping people recover from systematic manipulation and rebuild their confidence in their own judgment. I started seeing Dr. Walsh weekly, not because I doubted my mental stability, but because I wanted to understand how I'd been vulnerable to Marcus and Catherine's deception and how to protect myself from similar manipulation in the future. The sessions helped me recognize patterns in how they'd gradually undermined my confidence and isolated me from potential supporters.
Dr. Walsh explained that the conspiracy had used sophisticated psychological techniques to make me question my own perceptions and judgment. The gradual escalation of criticism, the strategic use of concerned friends to validate their narrative, and the systematic isolation from supportive relationships were all classic elements of what psychologists call gaslighting, a form of emotional abuse designed to make victims doubt their own sanity. Understanding the psychological mechanics of what had been done to me was both validating and empowering. I hadn't been weak or stupid for falling victim to their manipulation. I'd been targeted by people who'd perfected techniques for exploiting trust and love. The fact that I'd eventually recognized what was happening and fought back effectively proved my mental strength rather than revealing any weakness or instability. The criminal trial began 6 months after the wedding arrests, drawing national media attention to our small community. Marcus and Catherine were being tried together along with several other key conspirators, facing charges of wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering. The prosecutors had built their case around thousands of documents, recorded conversations, and testimony from dozens of victims who'd been defrauded over the years. I was scheduled to testify as the primary witness against Marcus and Catherine, describing how I discovered their affair, documented their criminal activity, and ultimately exposed the entire network at their wedding. Patricia had prepared me extensively for the cross-examination, warning me that defense attorneys would try to portray me as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge rather than a crime victim seeking justice. The courthouse was packed with reporters, victims, and curious spectators when I took the witness stand. Marcus and Catherine sat at the defense table looking remarkably different from the confident conspirators I'd confronted at their wedding. Prison clothing had replaced Catherine's designer outfits, and the stress of legal proceedings had aged both of them visibly in just a few months. I testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through my discovery of the affair, my investigation of their criminal activity, and my decision to confront them publicly at their wedding. The prosecutors had me explain each piece of evidence I'd gathered, from the security camera recordings to the financial documents that proved systematic asset theft. The defense attorneys tried several strategies to undermine my credibility. They suggested I'd been obsessed with animal rescue work to the detriment of my marriage, that I'd been paranoid and suspicious without justification, and that I'd manufactured evidence to support false accusations against innocent people who'd simply fallen in love. But the documentary evidence I'd gathered was too comprehensive and compelling to dismiss as the fantasy of a deranged ex-wife. Catherine's attorney made the most aggressive attempt to discredit my testimony, suggesting that I'd been stalking my ex-husband and former friend, violating their privacy through illegal surveillance, and orchestrating their arrests out of jealousy rather than genuine concern about criminal activity. The strategy backfired when the prosecutor presented recordings of Catherine discussing her manipulation techniques and bragging about her ability to deceive the women she was helping to defraud. Marcus's attorney took a different approach, portraying his client as a successful businessman who'd made some questionable decisions under the influence of a manipulative woman who'd seduced him into criminal activity. This strategy also failed when prosecutors presented evidence of Marcus's central role in organizing the fraud network years before he'd met Catherine. The trial revealed details about the conspiracy that hadn't been public before, including the sophisticated methods they'd used to hide assets and manipulate legal proceedings. Expert witnesses explained how shell companies had been created and managed, how offshore accounts had been used to conceal money, and how corrupt professionals had coordinated their efforts to maximize the fraud's effectiveness. The most damaging testimony came from other victims who described similar patterns of manipulation and theft in their own divorce cases. A parade of intelligent, accomplished women took the stand to describe how they'd been systematically deceived and defrauded by the same network that had targeted me. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar, involving trusted professionals who'd exploited their vulnerability during one of the most difficult periods of their lives. Dr. Rebecca Walsh testified as part of her own plea agreement, describing how she'd been recruited to provide fraudulent psychological evaluations that would support claims of mental instability in divorce cases. Her testimony was particularly damaging to Catherine, revealing detailed discussions about how to manipulate me specifically and other victims generally to maximize the fraud's effectiveness. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against Marcus, Catherine, and their co-conspirators. Marcus was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $14 million in restitution to victims. Catherine received 8 years and was ordered to pay $6 million in damages. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from 2 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement in the scheme. The sentences were longer than I'd expected, reflecting both the scope of the conspiracy and the judge's determination to send a strong message about financial fraud targeting vulnerable people. During the sentencing hearing, I was allowed to present a victim impact statement describing how Marcus and Catherine's betrayal had affected my life and the lives of other women who'd been targeted by their network. Standing at the podium in that federal courtroom, looking directly at the two people who'd tried to destroy my life, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing throughout the long legal process. They'd taken my trust, my marriage, my sense of security, and nearly $2 million of my money. But they hadn't taken my strength, my intelligence, or my ability to fight for justice when it mattered most. The civil recovery process continued for several more months as forensic accountants traced assets through complex webs of shell companies and fraudulent transactions.
Patricia's team worked with federal authorities to seize properties, freeze accounts, and liquidate investments that had been purchased with stolen money. The process was complicated by the international scope of some investments, but eventually we recovered most of the money that had been stolen from my marriage. More importantly, I received significant additional damages for the emotional distress and reputational harm I'd suffered during the conspiracy. The total recovery exceeded $4 million, more than doubling the assets I would have received in an honest divorce settlement. Marcus and Catherine's attempt to steal my financial security had ultimately made me wealthier than I'd ever been before, but the money was less important than the vindication and the knowledge that justice had been served not just for me, but for all the other women who'd been victimized by the network. The conspiracy had been completely dismantled, its leaders were in prison, and new safeguards had been implemented to prevent similar schemes from operating in the future. The animal shelter thrived in the aftermath of the case, receiving donations and support from people across the country who'd been inspired by the story of fighting back against systematic deception. We expanded our facilities, hired additional staff, and launched new programs that served animals and their human companions throughout the region. I also started a new organization focused on helping women protect themselves during divorce proceedings and other vulnerable life transitions. The Women's Financial Security Initiative provided education about recognizing manipulation, resources for finding trustworthy professional help, and support networks for women dealing with systematic deception. The program grew rapidly as more women learned about the sophisticated techniques being used to exploit them during difficult periods. A year after the wedding arrests, I was invited to speak at a national conference on financial fraud and victim advocacy. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of law enforcement officials, victim advocates, and other survivors, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that devastating day when I'd overheard Marcus and Catherine planning my betrayal to this moment of recognition and empowerment. The woman who discovered their affair had been shattered by the betrayal, uncertain about her ability to survive alone in a world that suddenly seemed dangerous and unpredictable. The woman speaking at that conference had learned to trust her instincts, fight for justice, and build something meaningful from the wreckage of her former life. Marcus and Catherine had tried to steal my past, but they'd inadvertently given me a future that was stronger, more independent, and more purposeful than anything I could have imagined when I was married and trusting. Their betrayal had been devastating, but my response to that betrayal had revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed and opened doors I never would have walked through otherwise. The fairy tale romance they'd built on lies and theft had ended exactly as it deserved to end, with justice served and truth revealed. But my story was just beginning, and this time, I was writing it myself. 2 years later, I stood in the sunroom of my new house, watching morning light filter through windows that looked out over 20 acres of rolling hills where rescued horses grazed peacefully in emerald pastures. The property was everything I dreamed of but never dared to pursue while married to Marcus, who'd always dismissed my suggestions about expanding our animal rescue work as impractical fantasies that would drain our resources. The irony was perfect. The money Marcus had stolen to fund his elaborate deception had ultimately given me the financial freedom to build something far more meaningful than the modest suburban life we'd shared. The $4 million in civil recovery had allowed me to purchase this sanctuary property, construct state-of-the-art facilities for animal rehabilitation, and establish an endowment that would fund operations for decades to come. My phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Sarah Collins, who'd become an unexpected friend during the long months of investigation and trial. The message was brief but satisfying. Catherine denied parole. Marcus transferred to maximum security after incident with cellmate. Justice keeps working. I smiled, remembering the woman who'd once sat across from me at Rosemary's Bistro, pretending to care about my marriage while planning its destruction. Federal prison had stripped away Catherine's designer veneer, revealing the calculating predator underneath. Her appeals had all failed, her assets remained seized, and her 8-year sentence stretched ahead with no possibility of early release. Marcus faced an even grimmer future. His arrogance hadn't served him well in federal prison, where financial criminals occupied the bottom of the social hierarchy. The incident Agent Collins mentioned was likely another confrontation with inmates who had little patience for men who'd built fortunes by stealing from vulnerable women. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts, announcing the arrival of Rachel Morrison, a woman who'd contacted me through the Women's Financial Security Initiative. Her story was depressingly familiar. A successful marketing executive whose husband had convinced her to trust him with their joint finances while secretly transferring assets to hidden accounts. Like me, Rachel had discovered the betrayal through seemingly innocent conversations that revealed careful planning to leave her destitute. Unlike me, Rachel had learned about the warning signs before her divorce was finalized. The educational materials my organization had developed, based on hard-won experience with Marcus and Catherine's schemes, had helped her recognize manipulation tactics before they could completely destroy her financial security. Rachel brought documentation of her husband's suspicious activity, hoping she could help her understand whether she was dealing with simple infidelity or systematic fraud.
As we spread the papers across my kitchen table, I recognized patterns that had become unfortunately familiar through my work with other victims. Shell company formations using variation of family names, sudden interest in cryptocurrency investments that couldn't be easily traced, real estate transactions involving properties that officially belonged to business associates but were actually controlled by her husband. Most telling of all, a marriage counselor who seemed remarkably interested in Rachel's career dedication and emotional stability. We spent 3 hours documenting the evidence and developing a strategy for protecting Rachel's interests before her husband realized she discovered his plans. Patricia Hendricks had agreed to take Rachel's case at reduced rates, part of her commitment to helping women who'd been targeted by similar schemes. By afternoon, Rachel left with a clear plan for confronting her husband's deception and recovering her assets before they could disappear into the maze of offshore accounts and fraudulent transactions that had become standard practice among divorce fraudsters. Watching her drive away, I felt the deep satisfaction that came from turning my painful experience into protection for someone else. The Women's Financial Security Initiative had helped over 200 women during its first 2 years of operation, providing education, resources, and connections to trustworthy professionals who specialized in complex divorce fraud cases. The program had grown beyond my initial vision, with chapters in 12 states and partnerships with law enforcement agencies that were investigating similar networks. But the most meaningful work happened right here on the sanctuary property, where women dealing with betrayal and financial manipulation could find healing through caring for animals who'd also survived abandonment and abuse. The parallel experiences created profound connections between human and animal survivors, fostering recovery that went deeper than any traditional therapy program. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had become the sanctuary staff psychologist, offering both individual counseling and group therapy sessions that incorporated animal-assisted healing techniques. Women who'd been systematically deceived found that caring for rescued animals helped rebuild their confidence in their own judgment and their ability to recognize genuine need versus manipulation. The horses were particularly effective therapists, responding to authentic emotion while remaining completely unmoved by artificial charm or deceptive behavior. Women who'd been gaslighted into doubting their perceptions discovered that horses reflected their true emotional state, validating feelings they'd been taught to dismiss as irrational or inappropriate. Sarah, a former client who lost nearly everything to her ex-husband's cryptocurrency scam, now managed the sanctuary's equine therapy program. Her transformation from a broken woman who questioned her own sanity to a confident advocate for other survivors embodied the healing that was possible when validation replaced isolation. The anniversary of Marcus and Catherine's arrest passed quietly, marked only by a small celebration with the sanctuary staff and volunteers who'd become my chosen family. We toasted not their imprisonment, but the community of strong women we'd built from the wreckage of their betrayal. As evening approached, I walked through the pastures where rescued animals grazed in contentment, their trust slowly rebuilt through patient care and consistent kindness.
The woman who'd stood up at that wedding 2 years ago had been seeking justice for herself. The woman walking among these peaceful animals had found something more valuable: the power to transform betrayal into healing for others. The fairy tale Marcus and Catherine had tried to steal from me was always an illusion, built on dependency and trust that could be weaponized against me. The life I'd built in its place was solid and real, founded on strength I'd discovered within myself and connections forged through shared survival. Their love story had ended in handcuffs and prison sentences. My story was still being written, one rescued animal and one empowered woman at a time. And this time, nobody else held the pen.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.